So what we're going to do today is, Karina, is talk about a little bit more detail about capillaries. So we mentioned them yesterday when we were talking about types of blood vessels, but we're going to go into some more detail today. But what I want to remind you of, so arteries, capillaries, veins are all types of blood vessels, and really they're all connected to each other. So arteries turn into capillaries, which turn into veins. So even though we talk about what each of them does separately and how they're set up, really they're all just an extension of each other. So they're all continuous throughout the body. So if we look at this, as we look at this picture, if we have blood flowing from left to right, okay, this would be an artery, which eventually branches off so small that blood cells can only go through single file, and then we call it a capillary. After the blood goes through this capillary, those little tiny capillaries start merging back together, and then they form a vein. And that's going to return the blood back to the heart. So that's how this is set up. And these capillaries, they're everywhere in our body. All of our body tissue is surrounded by these capillaries. They're everywhere. They're very, very small, so we don't really see them, but they surround every single cell in our body. So we're going to have to understand how things are moving and what's what when we look at this kind of a diagram. So this shows what we call the capillary network. And it's kind of simplified, but you can still understand basically how things move and what substances are going back and forth. So this whole thing would be called a capillary. And in this diagram, blood would be flowing from left to right. So what would this type of blood vessel be? Raise your hand if you could say, what is number one? What type of blood vessel? Logan?
Wait, never mind.
Marley? Yeah, it's an artery because the blood's going away from the heart, headed to these body cells. So that's an artery. This section in the middle is the capillary, again, because it's so narrow and thin. Blood cells are going through single file. And then at the end, when it starts to merge together, what blood vessel would number two be, Nikita?
Vein.
Yeah, that would be a vein. That would be headed back to the heart to return this blood and recirculate it again. So we have arteries, which turn into capillaries, which turn into veins. So what these sort of body-shaped things represent are cells in our body. It might be brain cells. It could be cells in our intestines or in our muscles or in our heart. They're just sort of general body cells. And almost every cell in our body is very, very close to a capillary. So what do these little circles represent here that are moving through this capillary? Nick?
Oxygenated blood.
You're on the right track. I'm just going to call them something a little more general. Dan?
Red blood cells.
Yeah, they're red blood cells. They are what make our oxygenated blood, but yeah, let's call them red blood cells. And again, in this diagram, I'm using red and blue, but remember, the blood's not really red and blue. It's just how we can better show when it's losing oxygen. Now that leaves us with number 5. Number 5 is, it's pointing to like this, all this space that are around these body cells. Now it's not just like air, it's not empty space there. What are all of our body cells surrounded by? So it's a word we've used in another body system. Has a name. Charming, what are you going to say? No? Kayla?
Cytoplasm.
Well, the cytoplasm is in these cells, but outside of them is something else. Marla? No?
Cell wall.
No?
Plasma.
What?
Plasma.
Plasma? It's close. So plasma is the liquid part of our blood. But when it gets forced out and it's in around our cells, we give it another name. In fact, another body system is named after this. No. Tim? It's lymph. Remember, lymph is body fluid. It's the fluid that surrounds all of our cells. When it comes out of our blood, we call it lymph. When it's in our blood, we call it plasma. Number 6 here is this arrow represents a substance that's moving. And if you look closely, this arrow shows a substance that's moving from a red blood cell and going into a body cell. So in our capillaries, this happens constantly. What is that substance that would be moving that way? Tim?
Wait. I don't know.
What would be going from a red blood cell into a body cell? Nikita? Yeah, it's oxygen. That's what red blood cells deliver to our body cells. So as the blood cells move through this capillary, they give up their oxygen, they give it to one of the body cells. I've already told you about number 7. So these red blood cells, they're not just sort of moving through air. What is the stuff that surrounds them and carries them through the blood vessels? When it's in the blood, though, we call it something else. Plasma.
Something else.
So that's plasma.
Yeah.
Now, number 8. So if you look carefully, number 8 is not showing something moving from a blood cell into the body cell. It's showing something that's moving from the plasma into the cell. So what things are carried by the plasma that are given to the body cells? Tim?
Iron?
That would be an example. But what would be, iron is a what?
Mineral.
So other minerals, maybe also glucose.
Calcium.
So all of those things, what is that big category of? Glucose and vitamins and minerals. Nutrients. These are nutrients. The nutrients that our blood provides are dissolved in the plasma, and as the blood goes by our cells, some of those nutrients diffuse out. And that leads us to the last one, another arrow. This arrow is showing something that's moving from a body cell into our blood. So what stuff moves that way from our body cells into our blood? Nikita?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide is one of these. What is, like, the category? What would we call carbon dioxide? Is a type of waste. These are wastes. Could be other types of waste besides carbon dioxide, but usually carbon dioxide might be the first one we think of. And so, as blood goes through the capillary, it gives up its oxygen, it gives up the nutrients, and it takes in waste from the cells, and then continues back to the heart, where it's going to recirculate and get rid of that stuff. And that's how our capillaries work. Every part of our body, all of our tissue, has a network of these capillaries to provide the oxygen and the nutrients that our cells need. I'm going to skip these 2 next slides until we get to review. We'll go back to them. This is a picture. This is on your microscope. So this shows what a capillary actually looks like. And so what you have is, this would be an artery. And as you don't have this, it's okay. As it branches off into these areas, you see it gets so narrow, the blood cells have to move single file. These would be the capillaries. And as the blood cells are moving, these are body cells, all these things that have the nucleus in them. And so oxygen would be diffusing into those cells. Their carbon dioxide would be diffusing into the blood, and that would be what a capillary really looks like.
Oh, whoa.
So we talked a little bit yesterday about that bodies exhibit. So there's a couple diagrams here that show a body where the only thing that's left, they've removed all parts except for the arteries and capillaries. And so what you can see is how much of our body has capillaries in it.
A lot.
Basically all of it. We can see the exact shape of the hand and all the fingers because everywhere we have tissue, we really have capillaries. There's a larger picture. You can see a whole body. And again, all this stuff that's in red, the bones are still in there. All this stuff in red are where there were those blood vessels. So basically, they take up our entire body is covered in this network. Yeah, a rabbit, and another picture of the hand.
Are those real?
Yeah. All right, our last topic for today is about a little bit about heart disease, and we'll talk about a bunch of different things. There's not a whole lot for you to write, but we'll talk about a bunch of things. I'm sure all of you know someone, whether it's in your family or a friend's family, that has had some form of heart disease. Heart disease is one of the most common types of illness that affects people. And there's different types of heart disease, and we'll talk about a couple of them. So how many people you could think of somebody that has heart, whether it's high blood pressure, high cholesterol, had a heart attack, had angioplasty or a stent? Okay, a lot of you. So, a couple things. First off, our heart. We know our heart is a muscle. It's made of muscle tissue. But like any other tissue in our body, in order for our heart muscle to work, it needs nutrients. It needs oxygen. And even though it's filled with blood on the inside, it doesn't actually absorb the oxygen from that blood. It has its own blood vessels that are on the outside. They're called the coronary arteries. And so what you see in this diagram, what is this?
Aorta.
That's the aorta. So that carries the blood and it goes to all parts of the body. You can see here there's a couple branches very early on in the aorta that bring the blood to the outside of the heart. These are arteries that give the heart muscle itself oxygen. That's very important because if the heart muscle doesn't have oxygen, it can't beat. It can't contract, and therefore none of the other parts of the body can get oxygen. So these coronary arteries are very important. Okay? They bring oxygen to the heart. But sometimes they do get clogged. What kind of things can clog our arteries? Logan?
Bacteria?
Not so much bacteria. That would be an infection. Michael? Fats and...
The flat thing?
Yeah, plaque. When those fats build up, we call it plaque.
Yeah.
What's one of the main fats that we get in our diet that can lead to the thickening of our arteries like that? Nikita?
Cholesterol?
Yeah, cholesterol. Cholesterol is a fatty substance found only in animal products, and it's one of the things that can form these plaques inside of our blood vessels. Okay? And when that happens, we call that arterial sclerosis, where the arteries have sort of been thickened and they're no longer flexible, and there's a buildup of fats and cholesterols on the inside. So a normal, healthy artery is nice and smooth on the inside. The blood can flow very easily through it. But when these fats build up, when these plaques build up inside of our blood vessels, well, now the blood has a much harder time going through. And when it gets narrow, that increases the pressure on those blood vessels as well. They can eventually become so clogged that blood can't flow at all through them. And that's a very dangerous situation. Jackie?
How can only 5% of your heart be working?
What's that?
How can only like 5% of your heart be working?
I don't know. Where did you hear that?
My grandpa's heart only works like 5%.
Oh, what they're probably talking about is when a coronary artery like that is blocked, they often will say it's 95% blocked. And that may be what you're referring to, meaning only 5% of the blood that should be getting to his heart is actually getting there. Okay? And that it's almost completely closed. But it's not fully closed yet. And so that's, again, a dangerous situation. And we'll talk about how they know if it's closed up and some of those things in a minute. But it also can lead to what we call hypertension or high blood pressure. You know, yesterday we talked about when they measure your blood pressure, right?
Yeah.
So your blood pressure, they measure in your arteries, and if it's elevated, that can be dangerous. And your blood pressure could be elevated by things like stress, genetics, You know, your family may have a genetic trait that just you tend to get high blood pressure. Other things like the diet that you eat, how much exercise you do, those things can also affect your blood pressure. And so if a person does have some sort of blockage, in a coronary artery especially, like if this is the artery bringing blood to their heart and it's getting clogged up with these plaques, this buildup, they can do a couple things. The first step might be is what's called angioplasty. In angioplasty, what they do is they take a very long, very thin wire. They usually will insert it into an artery that's in the groin area, in the hip. And they can guide this wire. And they basically guide it all the way up a person's artery through their leg, all the way through the arteries that go up their abdomen and into their chest, like that. Then it loops around, they guide it into the aorta, and then they could guide it actually into the chambers of the heart. And they can also get it into other places, arteries and so forth. And then they could inject a dye in there, and then you can use an x-ray and you can see that dye. And that tells how the heart's pumping. It can tell if there's a blockage in an artery. And so that's one of the ways they can diagnose if a person has this sort of condition when their arteries are getting clogged. So it's called angioplasty. But also on that wire, they often will put a little tool that's called a balloon. And they basically guide this wire in the balloon till they get it right into the blockage here. And then they inflate the balloon with air. And it sort of swells up. And what it does, it kind of pushes against the side of the artery. It kind of smushes that plaque, widening that artery. So again, this would be, 50% blocked here. But after inflating the balloon, it's more like only 10 or 15% blocked. So this is one way they can have to try to open up to allow more blood to flow to the heart. That's called balloon angioplasty. Other times, they may do a similar thing. Does anyone know someone that has a stent in their heart? Okay. And what they do in that case is almost the same thing. So again, with the stent, there's a blockage. See, this one's really blocked. This would be like 95%. They get the balloon into the blockage, but then not only do they have a balloon, but they have a little wire mesh attached to it. And when they inflate the balloon, it opens up the artery, and this metal mesh also expands. And then when they take the balloon out, though, this mesh stays inside. It's kind of like it reinforces the artery so that it's not going to close down again. Usually these stents have medicine on them that is slowly released that prevents any plaques from building up on them. So it's one way of allowing that blood vessels to stay open for an even longer period of time. So that's inserting a stent. Akira?
What if the stent doesn't stay?
It does. I mean, once it expands, I think it always does. But there could be complications.
Kind of like a question.
Okay.
Like, where would these be?
In very small blood vessels, usually in those coronary arteries that are feeding the heart blood, those are often the ones that if they're blocked, then your heart doesn't get oxygen and it stops working. So those are the ones they need to be sure are opened up, and they'll often put these in those coronary arteries. Fine?
That was in my dad, except in his carotid artery.
Okay.
That was 90% blocked.
Okay, yeah. They'll do them in other places, like the carotid artery that's in your neck that brings blood up to your brain. If that gets blocked, again, that would be a dangerous situation. So they might put a stent in there. Tim?
Is your jugular an artery?
No, it's a vein. Now, this is like the first steps. They'll try to do angioplasty with the balloon. They may try a stent. But there are times when, here's another diagram. This is a little bit better. So here they're putting a stent in this artery, this coronary artery. You can see it's narrowed. They get the wire and the balloon and the stent in, inflate the stent, then deflate the balloon, pull the wire out, and the mesh stays inside.
Does that hurt?
I don't
They
think
put,
so.
They get put to sleep.
Yeah, but I don't think you can feel. I'm not sure. Somebody asked that the other day. I never researched it, but if you're getting angioplasty, whether you can feel the wire moving, I have to find that answer that out. Now, if the stent doesn't work and so forth, and those coronary arteries in the heart are really blocked, then they may do bypass surgery. Does anyone know somebody that had to have a bypass? So a bypass is, so this is your heart. Here are the two coronary arteries. Well, if there's a blockage here, you could understand probably now how this works. So as the blood gets pumped out through the aorta, normally some of it would go down the coronary artery and go to the parts of the heart. But if there's a blockage here, well, now the blood could only get this far, and so these parts of the heart aren't going to be getting enough oxygen. Or it might happen in the other coronary artery. The process is the same. It also comes off of the aorta and feeds blood to the heart. But if there's a blockage here, again, these parts of the heart aren't going to get oxygen. So what they do in a bypass surgery is they may take a vein from your leg, and they do, you're asleep, and they may take that vein out, cut it out, and then they sort of paste it into your heart. What they do is they connect one end to the aorta, then they connect the other end down lower on the coronary artery. So now when blood flows through the aorta, some of it goes down this new vein, and it can get to these parts of the heart. It sort of went around this blockage. That's why it's a bypass. It bypasses the blockage so that blood can get to the heart. Or they may do it a different way. There's another way to do it where they take a mammary artery that's already a part of the aorta, and they cut it and they reattach it to this part of the coronary artery. So again, blood flows through that, and it can feed all the parts of the heart. But to do that type of surgery, heart surgery, how do they access your heart? Yeah, they have to. So the traditional way is to cut open your whole chest cavity. And so that's a procedure that has risks that are associated with it. Also has a really long recovery, because to do the surgery, they need to cut through first the skin in your chest, then through your muscle, your pectoral muscles, and then what's next? Your sternum. And they basically have to saw down the middle of the sternum through this bone. And then to get at the heart, they use a tool called a rib spreader. And this rib spreader, it has these two flat prongs. They go, after they saw the sternum, they put that in, and then they start cranking this, and it slowly spreads apart these two clamps, and that slowly sort of spreads apart the sternum until they can see your heart, and they can actually start to do surgery on it. Now, the problem with this, I'll answer your questions in a minute. The problem is that, so then they'll do their surgery, then they'll close you up, and they'll use staples or stitches to sew all the parts up. But the recovery takes a long time because your heart needs to heal. That bone that they sawed through, that needs to heal. Your muscles and your skin need to heal. So after bypass surgery, open heart surgery is what it's called, you usually have to be in the hospital for weeks until you can recover. I'll talk in a minute about an alternative to open heart surgery. So that's why it's so it's such a major surgery. Now, this next is just a picture. It's not a real photo, but this shows sort of what it would look like. So again, they make the incision through the skin, the muscle, saw the bone, get the rib spreader in there, crank it until it's spread open enough that they can operate on your heart. The next is a real picture, so if you don't like that kind of stuff, you don't need to look. But it's not too, it's hard to see. But so here you have the rib spreader. You can see these are the clamps that are in the sternum, and they've opened it up, spread it apart enough so that they can work. This is the heart in here.
That's a real picture?
Yeah, that's a real picture.
Yeah, the skin.
All right, what were the questions about the heart surgery? So Tim?
My grandfather had a quadruple bypass, and he has a scar coming like from right here all the way down to almost his belly.
Yeah, for those, they need to open up your whole chest cavity.
Yeah.
And when they say like a double bypass or quadruple bypass, They're talking about how many of those blockages they need to go around. And the more there are, the harder the surgery is. Kayla?
Like, you know, they cut the bone. Like,
Yep.
when you break the bone, it heals by itself. With that, they just let it heal by itself.
Yeah, it heals. They basically, I think they use a staple to hold the parts of it together while it heals. Jackie?
My grandpa, he's had a lot of heart surgery because he has a lot of heart problems. And sometimes his heart decides to stop, so it shots his heart.
Oh, does he have a pacemaker?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
My grandma had that.
your heart has a special area that every second or so sends an electrical signal that tells it when to contract and beat. And it has to all be synchronized, like the atrium has to contract, then the ventricle. If things get out of sync, then your heart doesn't pump blood correctly. And so some people that happens frequently, and so they have to have a little electric device put into their heart called a pacemaker that monitors their heartbeat, and if things get sort of out of rhythm, it'll send a little electrical impulse and get it back in rhythm, and that's what a pacemaker is. It's also, you may have seen like at school or in sports, Tim may carry to your games on AED device. That's called a defibrillator. And fibrillation is when the heart starts sort of beating very quickly, not quite contracting all the way, just kind of fluttering. And that device, they hook the pads up to a person, and it sends, well, that's the manual one. The automatic one like we have in school, you just put the pads on somebody's chest, and it determines if they need a shock. You press the button, and it gives it to them. On TV, if you watch, Grey's Anatomy 24 hours a day like my daughter, you may see they have the pads, and they put them on, they say clear, and they shock them.
That thing?
Yeah, that's the same idea if a person's heart is in an abnormal rhythm. All right, the other thing. All right, guys, listen. The other way now of doing sort of these types of surgeries is much less damaging and is a much shorter recovery. And it's doing this robotic surgery. So this is this tool that there's DaVinci is the brand, but there's other types. But anyway, it's a type of tool that a surgeon can use to do a surgery, and it has several benefits. Don't pack up your stuff yet. So it has several benefits. What happens is, this is the doctor. This guy here is the surgeon. He's sitting away from the patient. He's at a little console. And he can see in this monitor, he has a 3D view. His hands are operate two tools. His feet can operate some of the tools as well. And the actual tools that go into a person are these arms.
That's unsafe.
And so you see this long kind of rod? Instead, what they do, instead of cutting open a person's whole chest, these arms just sort of puncture into a person's body. So usually they can go in, depending on which organ they're operating on. Hold on. No. They can poke one in, guys, between the ribs. They can get some under the ribs. One of them usually goes in the belly button, so there's no scar afterwards. And then the doctor, Logan, turn around. Then the doctor, one of these has a camera, so that's what the doctor's seeing. It has a camera and a light, so he can see what's inside your body. And as he moves his hands and feet, these arms move. He could put different attachments on them. Some are for cutting, some are for grasping, some are for stitching. And so, because they don't have to cut your whole body open, you can recover from this surgery much quicker than you could having full open heart surgery. It's not only used for open heart surgery. My dad had prostate surgery because he had prostate cancer. They used the robot to do that surgery. People can have it for all different types of surgery. It allows the doctor to use to have much greater control without damaging a person by cutting them open. I got to use this. They brought it to the high school last year, and people could just go in and try and check it out. And you can use it, and you pick up little rubber bands, and you could do stuff with it. It's pretty neat to see. And I'll show you a demonstration of it in a minute. Kayla?
On Grey's, when they do like surgeries, why do they have like screens, like when they put like tubes down people's throat and stuff? Why do they have screens?
They're to prevent any bacteria from. They're there to make it a sanitary environment. I'm going to show you a couple of videos here to show how the DaVinci works. Pretty.
Is it gonna like actually?
No, they're just demonstrations. They're like this first one's a